I think it's inevitable. Anyone who doubts that he's got the level to be one of the best strikers in the Premier League really isn't paying attention. He'd be a boost to pretty much any Premier League team.
Summer transfers, there's nothing like them. And just as business started to get exciting, 10 days in, the transfer window has closed. Now, of course, the reason for this unusual transfer window was to allow clubs like Manchester City and Chelsea to sign players for the FIFA Club World Cup, which kicks off on Sunday. So don't worry, the window will be open again on Monday, the 16th of June. However, despite the window primarily being for those competing in the tournament in America, it hasn't stopped Premier League clubs splashing the cash. With the likes of Matthias Cunha, Jeremy Frimpong, Liam Delap and Ryan Šeško already making moves, there's surely more to follow. So let's take a look at some other transfers we expect to happen once the window reopens. First up, it's Florian Wirtz. He has been flirting with a move to Liverpool for what feels like an age now. However, it looks like the move is happening according to talkSPORT sources.
There was reports last night that a fee had been agreed for Florian Wirtz, 150 million euros. Wow. I have to say that was quickly played down as being premature. I think it will happen. I think Florian Wirtz will be a Liverpool player in the not too distant future, but I don't think the fee will get quite as high as that. My information is Liverpool are willing to pay £100 million guaranteed, plus add-ons. The contract obviously is already agreed, no issue in terms of personal terms, and the clubs continue to negotiate. Knowing the Fenway Sports Group, I think they would be keen if they can to keep it under a British record fee, so it'll be interesting to see what the actual final figure is.
And joining me to chat about Wirtz and some other players is European football journalist Andy Brassell. Andy, thanks for joining me. What's the latest with this deal and what can Liverpool fans expect from the player?
I think it's inevitable that it's going to happen sooner or later. They're not miles apart on the transfer fee, which felt like it was a possibility going back a couple of weeks. Leverkusen have been pretty clear in that they want at least 150 million euros the whole time that they've been looking at the possibility of selling him, which really goes back over 6 months before they first proposed him a contract extension, which it looked like he would take, and he hasn't. He's really accelerated the issue by given his total preference to Liverpool. So since then, it's just been about closing the gap between what Leverkusen want and what Liverpool want to pay. Now, it seems that Liverpool have been given by FSG most of the latitude to go up to the maximum of what Leverkusen want. So really, it just feels like a bit of minor horse trading at this point, that we will get there at some point in the next little while, despite the tough talk on either side. And Wirtz is fully committed to it. You know, we've already had him pitching in on social saying that he's not going to pinch Alexis McAllister's number 10, which is very nice of him. He wants to be a team guy. Now, look, I think he is someone who delights in creating for others as much as he does scoring for himself. So it'll offer a completely different dimension to Liverpool. As I've said, they could really use him as a central player in a front three, who will sit a little bit deeper and maybe change the shape of Liverpool a bit. So it ends up almost in a front two with Salah and Gakpo, or Salah and Luis Diaz, however they want to play. But I think a big part of this is making sure that we know that Wirtz can create space, he can score goals, he can set up goals. But I think the creative part is the main part, because you don't get many players like this in the Premier League. And to give Mo Salah room as he gets further into his 30s to just score goals, I think is probably one of the big aims of it.
Next up, it seems like many clubs are in desperate need of a striker, and one of the most talked about names is Sporting Lisbon's Viktor Gyokeres. He scored 97 goals in 102 games over the last 2 seasons, and having worked with Ruben Amorim, all eyes are of course on a move to Manchester United. But will it happen, Andy?
Well, I think Manchester United fans have got more reason to be optimistic than they could a couple of weeks ago, because for weeks it looked as if Arsenal were leading the chase. And now we're kind of back to where we were. Everyone in Portugal for most of last season and certainly the first half of last season, knew that Viktor Gyokeres would go at the end of the season, and they assumed it would be Manchester United. Why? Well, because of the link with Ruben Amorim. Amorim is someone who has believed in Gyökeres since day one. You know, he was the guy who went into the boardroom at Sporting and said, I want you to pay a club record fee for this fella. And he basically wouldn't leave them alone until they did it. And it was a bit of a gamble for Sporting, a gamble that's paid off spectacularly well. There's no doubt about that. So Gyökeres sees Amorim as a huge part of his development into a top-level footballer, because he was a good player who was hungry when he arrived in Lisbon, and now anyone who doubts that he's got the level to be one of the best strikers in the Premier League really isn't paying attention. Given the season that Manchester United have just had, I could understand a bit of pessimism, and especially with no European football, that he wouldn't come. Now, Arsenal focusing mainly on Benjamin Sesko seems to have given United the advantage again. The only hold-up at the moment is, for the first time, a bit of a dark cloud over the relationship between Sporting and Gyökeres, because they were working towards this amicable exit this summer. Now, Gyökeres seems to be saying that you're holding it up, you're charging more money, or you're trying to charge more money than you said you would, because they've never insisted they would demand anything near the 100 million buyout clause that is in his contract. It was expected to be around 70 million euros, so about 57, 58 million pounds that would do the job. So there's a little bit of, I guess, like with the Wirtz deal, a little bit to unpick there. But it's still affordable, I think, for someone with that much upside, who's one of the best strikers in Europe at the moment. And if United can get this over the line, he'd be a boost to pretty much any Premier League team, give or take Manchester City, I suppose. So I think it would be a great deal for United if they could get it over the line.
Are you surprised that there aren't more suitors for him?
No, not really. I just don't think there's the money out there, really. So I think you could argue that he wouldn't be expensive as, say, Victor Osimhen in terms of wages. But having said that, it is a fair old chunk of change, and we know that United are going to have to sell to balance the books at some point. I guess what they feel is, A, they feel confident that they'll be able to shift a few, and B, they feel this is a chance to get this guy. And that's that. I think the fact that United have had this long-standing interest in them has kept them in the race, even when all logic has suggested that they would probably be out of it. Now, I guess the fact that he scored a lot of his goals in Portugal, of course he scored a lot of goals in the Champions League as well, but I think people have views on how much those goals are worth. Obviously, the weighting of that meant that Kylian Mbappe won the Golden Boot, not him. But I think most of the teams who are in the market for a major striker are in a position where they're maybe not 100% sure. I think in terms of what he's done in the Champions League and his partnership with Isak for Sweden, they really should be.
So Manchester United may well have a free run at Viktor Gyokeres because of this next player. Benjamin Sesko, the 22-year-old Slovenian, is edging closer to being Arsenal's new striker. There are reports that RB Leipzig will have to sell him to balance the books. So, Andy, what can you tell us about this? And what can you tell us about his future? And is it with Arsenal?
Well, I think selling him makes a lot of sense to them. And I think in terms of balancing the books, they've got a few little issues that I haven't really faced before. One of those is their transfer policy has changed a bit over the last couple of years, and you look at the big money they spent on Lois Openda when they brought him in from Lens 2 summers ago, and then the fact that they went the whole way and spent 80 million euros to make a permanent signing of Xavi Simons, who's not been amazing actually since they permanently signed him. They certainly couldn't get their money back if they sold him tomorrow, I don't think. And this is big money for Leipzig to be spending. Regardless of the age profile, what they think they'll make of it in the long term, at the moment, that they have spent more than that they would have imagined a couple of years ago, I think. in recent windows. And that's without talking about Antonio Nusa, investments for the future that they hope will appreciate over time. The other thing is, for the first time since they were promoted in 2016, that they haven't got into European competition. And that is a big gap in their finances. Of course, they were part of the expanded Champions League last season. So 4 home games, 8 group games, even though they went disastrously badly, that earned them a lot of money. And that chops a lot of cash out of their budget. So they have to do something about that. Now, Šeško, I guess the question is, how far do you hold on to the balloon? Because they always bought him knowing they were going to sell him down the line. I think if you talk to people at Salzburg, they would say that he had, and you've always got to do the comparison because Erling Haaland was the centre forward for Salzburg before him. Šeško has a better all-round game, but is not the natural goal scorer that Erling Haaland is. He's been adding goals to his game gradually, and a decent haul, over 20 goals in all competitions last season for Leipzig. But I guess it's the sort of profile of striker that you would expect Arsenal to go for. Someone that's really technically adept, a little bit different. He can be explosive in the penalty box, but to get to that point where he's going to be 20, 25 goals a season in the Premier League, I think it's going to take a little bit of patience. I think it's quite surprising that they've moved off Gyökeres towards him. Obviously, there's been a bit back and forth between Arteta and Berto, you would assume. But look, Šeško will fit into Arsenal really well. It's just how quickly they can get him scoring the amount of goals that they need a number 9 to score.
There have also been reports of Real Madrid's Rodrigo being targeted by Arsenal. Is that deal possible?
It is possible, but I think a lot of it is linked towards what happens with Vinicius Junior. Now, like most transfers, this doesn't stand alone. Real Madrid will not get rid of both Rodrigo and Vinicius Junior. Now, you might say, well, they're not going to get rid of Vinicius Junior. They might be forced to, actually, because they're in a position at the moment where they've been having tentative discussions on extending his contract for a while. Only got a couple of years left on his deal. There's the bogeyman of the Saudi Pro League over the right shoulder of Real Madrid saying, we will offer this guy whatever he wants. The real question is Vinicius really prepared to go and play there? Or is he just using them as leverage to get a better deal out of Real Madrid? He'll never quite get the money in Madrid that he could get in Saudi, of course, but he could get more of a deal than Real Madrid are perhaps prepared to offer him at the moment. Now, if they keep him, does that mean that someone gets pushed out? It always looked like it would be Rodrigo, but particularly in the first half of last season, his all-round work rate, the fact that he's so tactically adaptable, meant that he felt indispensable to Real Madrid. Now, he's got a little bit more left on his contract. He's got an extra year left on his contract compared to Vinicius. So the only way that that's really going to happen at the moment is, I think, if Rodrigo agitates for a move. So it's all about how important Xabi Alonso makes him feel. So much could change between now and the end of August. If this is something that's going to happen, it's not going to happen now. It's not going to happen next week. It will happen closer to deadline when Rodrigo knows where he stands and when he knows if he's really important to Xabi Alonso.
Now, all eyes are on Spurs. It's looking like their new manager will be Thomas Frank, and his first signing reportedly could be Antoine Semenyo. Is this the type of signing Spurs need? Well, maybe. Here's Paul Hawksby and Charlie Baker speaking to talkSPORT's chief football correspondent, Alex Crook.
Suddenly a few things started doing the rounds about Antoine Semenyo of Bournemouth to Spurs last night. Is there anything in it?
There've been conversations, as I understand it, between Tottenham and the Semenyo camp, but it would take a record fee more than Tottenham paid for Dominic Solanke from Bournemouth last summer. I'm just not sure Daniel Levy is going to sanction that deal. I know there's also been talks with Manchester United, but it looks like Brian Mbeumo is ahead of Semenyo there. And they're in quite a strong position to demand top dollar Bournemouth, because obviously Dean Howson has gone to Real Madrid for a 50 million buyout clause. Milos Kerkez, I understand, is getting closer to Liverpool. That'll be a deal in the region of £40 million. There's big interest from PSG in Elias Zabani as well. So if they were to sell all those three players, the likes of Semenyo, Tavernier, who's been linked with a couple of clubs, both in the Premier League and in Turkey, I think Bournemouth will be really keen to hang on to them because Andoni Iraola was very much on Tottenham's radar at one stage earlier this year, and he's decided to stay at Bournemouth, and I think he's been assured that the whole team isn't going to be sold from underneath him.
So it might be an expensive one for Spurs to pull off, but Semenyo's wage demands would be considerably less than Brentford's Bryan Mbeumo, who would be another option but looks set to join Manchester United instead, as he wants around £250,000 a week. With Semenyo currently getting paid around £50,000 a week on the South Coast, he would fit into Tottenham's wage structure a little better, considering they have just 4 squad members currently earning more than £100,000 a week. But Andy, money aside, is this the type of player they need?
Well, I think they need a bit more bang in the final third. And I think we've seen with Heung-min Son, who's been incredible for them over the last decade, it doesn't feel as if he can play week after week after week anymore. Now, I guess the real question is, how much has Son got left in the tank, and how much has Son got left in the tank in an 11 that's not Ange Postecoglou's? Because he was required to do way too much running, I think, in that system. Now, do they replace him as a sort of centre forward a lot of the time? Do they rest him for some of the games? What is the plan for Son, I think, is the big question. I think if they were to use him in less of a labour-intensive role off the ball where he can just score goals, I think he could still be really useful to them. And that, of course, would mean that they need at least one more wide player. Semenyo's been one of the better in the Premier League over the last season. The question is Daniel Levy really prepared to back Thomas Frank? He's going to have to some extent, having changed the coach, by doing that, especially after Spurs have won the Europa League, by saying we're ambitious to do better in the Premier League, and we are ambitious to do well in this Champions League. And, it's all going to start with the Super Cup against PSG, which at the moment seems like a bit of a mismatch unless Spurs up their level big time between now and then. So I think there are a few statements of intent needed, and certainly a bit more punch in the attacking third in the wide areas.
And finally, going back to Manchester United, it's all about their exits. Alejandro Garnacho seems like a very likely transfer out of Old Trafford. Andy, with Florian Wirtz heading out of the door at Bayer Leverkusen and Erik ten Hag in charge of the club, there's this running joke that the manager likes to bring in players he's already worked with before. So could this be the exit strategy for Garnacho at Manchester United, or even Antony?
It feels like Garnacho would be quite a hard deal to do, and I think it'll be quite a hard deal to do for a lot of clubs. Now, look, I think what's been clear, and when there's been the negotiations with Leverkusen and Liverpool over Florian Wirtz, it's that there will not be a player in part exchange because it's too expensive. Leverkusen don't only have a much smaller budget than Bayern Munich. They have, half the budget of Borussia Dortmund? They're not one of the absolute wealthiest clubs in the Bundesliga, despite the fact they're very well backed by Bayer, comparatively speaking. So for me, I find it quite difficult to imagine Garnacho going there. Now, of course, he was in discussions, and the club were in discussions with Napoli at the start of the year. I wonder if Manchester United look back on that and think, maybe if we'd have lowered the price a little bit, he would be someone else's problem by now. Look, we know the potential's there, but the money that United were asking for him, 70 million euros odd back in January, seems unbelievable to me, and seemed unbelievable to Napoli. Now, I think people looked at it at the time and said, oh, this is just Napoli being frugal, Aurelio De Laurentiis being frugal, this is what he does. I don't know how many more clubs out there are prepared to pay 50 million plus for Garnacho and to essentially bet the farm on him in terms of their resources. So Leverkusen, for me, definitely won't happen. Antony's an interesting one because clearly Betis would like to keep him. I assume he would like to stay at Betis because he had maybe his best time in club football period with them. The question is anyone prepared to pay United a decent fee for him? Because he was excellent with Betis in the second half of last season, but there's still a little bit of the unknown. How likely is that to be consistent? What is his real level? So I think to expect a Leverkusen to spend a load on a fee and a load on wages, unless it's a vastly reduced fee and perhaps he's minded to take some sort of wage cut, then maybe it's a possibility. I think more likely for Leverkusen is probably going to be someone like Nico Paz, who's had a great season, the Argentine playmaker at Como under Cesc Fabregas, who Real Madrid have a buyback option on him, so they could use him as some sort of collateral this summer. A couple of teams really interested in him. And for me, that sort of development project who's on the way up rather than a risk, a salvage operation, seems more like Leverkusen's cup of tea.
Well, there you have it. Andy, thank you for joining me. And don't forget to let us know in the comments which transfers you think will happen when the window reopens. Make sure you subscribe for all the latest football news here on talkSPORT. And don't forget to head to talksport.com for Alex Crook's transfer notebook to stay up to date with all the latest news.